So the focus of the teaching, or the methodology, the approach, you could say, is an approach that looks at this topic of enlightenment from practical daily living perspective, which we can call a bottom-up approach. There are the top-down approaches in non-dual teachings, which emphasize and look at not so much daily living and the practical deliverance of this transformation, but rather point at that aspect of the human being or the aspect of life experience that is unrecognized. And these two aspects are two aspects of the one thing. If liberation, if enlightenment comes with an inseparable benefit, if liberation or enlightenment delivers a practical outcome, and let's face it, if it doesn't deliver a practical outcome, what's the point? If it does deliver a practical outcome that is inseparable from the transformation, then it makes sense that we can investigate, we can inquire into this topic from both angles. They are both valid, given that they are essentially two perspectives or two sides of a singularity. So the teaching is suggesting that there is a practical outcome from the realization of self, or from, if we want to be more broad, the changes that happen through this process. And the practical outcome that is delivered is said to be happiness for the human being in daily living. And that happiness is not a happiness through achieving outcomes, but happiness through peace of mind. And peace of mind is defined as the absence or the end of suffering. So the important point that I'm making here is that it is happiness for the human being in daily living. And part of that happiness, which is peace of mind, part of that peace of mind setting in means that there has to be a clarity about daily living. Because after all, the benefit is happiness for the human being in daily living. So what is daily living? Daily living is essentially interhuman relationship. That's one part of daily living, interhuman relationship. Another part of daily living is decision making. The story of life unfolds through the mechanism of everyone making, many times in the day, decisions, choices. Now, I'm not suggesting by the terminology that a decision or a choice belongs to a separate independent entity, because, as we will discuss, the instrument through which consciousness is functioning, the combination of impersonal consciousness and the body-mind organism that we can call the human being, is not separate and independent. And yet, we can't deny that decisions get made. That's how life unfolds. We can't deny that life presents options, and at a particular moment, one of several or many options is picked. So decision making is part of daily living. And another factor that's very relevant and part of daily living, relevant to this topic, is biological reactions. Biological reactions that happen throughout the day, and psychological reactions. So let's look at biological reactions. Biological reactions are those things that happen as part of the flow of life, as part of the circumstance. So the example that we used last time was a group of friends in a taxi. Each of them, each one a human being, and the human being in each moment is a result of two factors. If we can find a third factor, then the concepts in the teaching start to lose traction. But the description here, and if you investigate it for yourself, is that the human being in each moment is a result of what came before. What came before that particular moment. The human being has been shaped by life. And in particular, the human being is a result of the genes that we didn't choose and the up-to-date conditioning, meaning the cumulative the accumulation of all of the new conditioning that life delivers moment after moment after moment throughout our life. So in each moment, the human being is a unique biological instrument with consciousness, or through which consciousness functions. And so from this perspective, we can see that whatever the human being does is life happening. Life functioning through the human being, having designed the human being a particular way in order for the human being to have to function the way that we do in each moment, according to our grand design. So we go to the 4 people in a taxi. We're in India, so we'll use an Indian example. And at the traffic lights, let's say a group of beggars come up to the car, and each of the 4 people in the car will have a different reaction to the situation. One might feel fear, the other might feel anger, another compassion, and the 4th interest. We're very programmed to be attached to outcomes, meaning attached to pleasure, essentially, craving pleasure and being averse to pain. Now, these biological reactions are exactly that. They're a biological reaction, expression, a movement in the moment by the human being who is functioning according to their genes and up-to-date conditioning. And the thinking mind, which has become obsessed with pleasure, 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 obsessed with insisting that the human being's a particular way according to expectations, because the belief is that if I am a particular way, that will deliver happiness, that will deliver completeness. Because of that, the thinking mind hears a description of 4 biological reactions: fear, anger, compassion, and interest. And it says, well, the first 2 don't sound at all beneficial. So they are bad biological reactions. So there's a judgment. And it says, oh, the one that had the reaction, the biological reaction of compassion, that's what is how we should all be. And the point here is that there are 4 people finding themselves in more or less the same circumstance. Each person has their own genes and up-to-date conditioning that will automatically express a particular way. The person doesn't have a choice. The person doesn't control what reaction happens, what biological reaction happens. And so if this starts to be seen more clearly, there is scope for the human being to start seeing the reactions in the moment, of which there are uncountable numbers of throughout the day, some very small and less noticeable, and others quite extreme. And if the human being can understand this point, that it's not about judging the biological reaction as valid or invalid, but rather it's about seeing the movement as a biological reaction in the moment. Understanding that that was a result of one's makeup. No control over the makeup, no control over the circumstance that we find ourselves in, and hence no control over the reaction. So even if someone says, well, I do have control over my biological reaction. I used to find myself getting angry, and now I find myself counting to 10 or taking 3 deep breaths, and after doing that, and before getting angry, the biological reaction of anger no longer happens. And if we look into this more closely, we'll see that that person, as a result of their past experience, maybe seeing that anger was arising regularly, came up with this solution. And what actually came up with the solution was the working mind, let's say, which is a result of the genes and the experience and up-to-date conditioning up to that point in time. So we might think that I am the one that came up with the solution, but rather life shaped us to come up with this solution. If we introduce the notion, which is more likely, is that we went to an anger management class, or we read an anger management booklet, and in that booklet there was the suggestion, the new conditioning, that next time you feel anger arising, see if you can take 3 deep breaths, see if you can count to 10, and then see if after that space, maybe the biological reaction of anger is not what continues to arise. And so if we look at that, we see life delivered new conditioning in the form of the book that gave us this suggestion, and that new conditioning became part of our up-to-date conditioning. And so what we think is my control over the anger is actually just a new biological reaction in the moment, which is the biological reaction of having a thought. Take 3 deep breaths. And then 3 deep breaths happen. And then, admittedly, after the 3 deep breaths, the biological reaction that can sometimes happen when the thought to take 3 deep breaths isn't there, may not arise. So there is the potential for one's biological reactions to change, but it will change, once again, based on the genes and up-to-date conditioning that we're not in control of. So going back to the taxi, 4 people find themselves in more or less the same situation, and one feels anger, one feels fear, the other compassion, and the other interest. There are 4 different biological reactions arising in 4 different biological instruments. If we can start to see, to witness as it happens in real time, or even after the event, that was a biological reaction, and to accept it as that, then the very usual psychological reactions which happen after a biological reaction, the psychological reaction that judges the biological reaction as appropriate or inappropriate, and then judges oneself as a success or a failure, can start to fall away. This applies to the way that we react in a restaurant, towards the waiter, in a relationship, towards our partner or our friends, how we react to a total stranger on the street, how we react when we watch something on television. Life is always a sequence of biological reactions. The biological reaction is part of the flow of life and therefore either pleasure or pain. The freedom that we have in life is not a freedom from pain, not a freedom of pleasure, 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 but rather a psychological freedom, the end of suffering, and that freedom is always on the level of our attitude to the flow of life. That means a freedom on the level of our attitude to the biological reactions that happen. And the attitude that is an attitude of freedom is an attitude that allows the flow of life to be as it is, allows the functioning of the human being in daily living to be as it is, understanding that that is a result of one's genes and up-to-date conditioning, two factors that we're not in control of and which dictate the way that we function in each moment. And the attitude that is one of the absence of freedom is an attitude of seeing the biological reaction as my doing, believing oneself to be a separate, independent entity in complete control of everything that we think, everything we feel, everything we say, and our behaviors, our actions. And then seeing ourselves that way and also believing that our happiness is to be found in outcomes, that really what needs to happen is we need to be a perfect human being in order to deliver pleasure, pleasure, pleasure. The other has to be a perfect human being. And with this combination of personal doership and attachment to outcome, then the attitude to the flow of life has to be one of resisting or trying to hold on to life as it is in a particular moment. So peace of mind is when that attitude falls away. And then life is allowed to flow. The human being is allowed to flow. So from a certain perspective, we can describe life as a predetermined story unfolding exactly as it's destined to unfold. And the biological reaction in each moment and the psychological reaction. So the psychological reaction we often call the thinking mind. The biological reaction is, or at least part of one aspect of the biological reactions is what we usually call the working mind. And so if we see that life is a predetermined story unfolding exactly as it's destined to unfold, seeing that each human being is functioning the only way they can in each moment, because life was only one way before. In theory, life could have been anything, infinite potentiality. If anything in life was different, then the whole unfolding would be different. But when we look back on life, we see that even though there was, in theory, infinite potentiality, only one potentiality actualizes. And because only one potentiality actualizes, what has come before is fixed. The one way that it actualized, which means at this very moment, we are not separate from the fixed that came before, which really means we are part of the fixed. Our movement is dictated, is determined by that which came before. The feelings we have in this moment is part of that unfolding. So if life can be seen to be a story unfolding, and all of the biological reactions that happen, all of the psychological reactions that happen, are all part of that story, all of the circumstances that we find ourselves in. If we find ourselves in a traffic jam, that's circumstance, and it's part of the experience, part of the creation. It is the creation in that moment. And the thinking mind, which is judging the experience as appropriate or inappropriate, that life should or shouldn't be this way, the thinking mind can start to dissolve. Because that thinking mind that is judging life as something that could be different can't remain indefinitely when life is seen as a happening that is this way, was previously a particular way, and therefore can't, once it has manifested a particular way, can't be different and couldn't have been different. So the logic or rationale of the thinking mind is in opposition with the understanding that sees life as a happening, unfolding, not according to my will or your will, but according to the will of life, or the will of God. And that story, that creation, the creation of life, the predetermined or the determined, the inevitable story of life unfolds through the mechanics of decisions being made moment after moment after moment. The decision is part of the story. We can look at it as A leads to B, leads to C, leads to D. And we can also look at it as D leads to C, leads to B, leads to A. If it is a story that is in existence, the movement doesn't only have to be A to B to C to D, but we can look at it as D to C to B to A. It's all already here. And so the mechanism by which life unfolds is the mechanism of decision making. So the decision happens through the human being, part of the story of life, but it's a decision that was always destined to happen. The only decision that can be made, given the circumstance the way it is, and the human being being the way that they are. So we can see that in theory, the human being is not in control of the decision that gets made. The decision is a result of the circumstance, not in our control, and our genes and up-to-date conditioning, not in our control. In the moment, there is the feeling of free will, which we can't discount, a feeling that I am completely free to choose any one of the 5 options. And one option at a certain point in time, as destined, is picked. And then we see that the outcome of picking a particular option is not in our control. So we choose the orange juice at a restaurant after having looked at the menu, all part of the circumstance. The choice that we make is based on our genes and up-to-date conditioning and the circumstance we find ourselves in, a choice that we were always destined to make based on those factors. We make the choice and we order the orange juice, and then 5 minutes later the waiter returns and says, for example, I'm sorry, we've run out of oranges, so you can't have any orange juice. So once we've made the decision, the outcome not in your control. Or the waiter comes back and gives you your orange juice. So the fact that we get what we want sometimes doesn't mean that we're in control, because sometimes we get what we want and sometimes we don't get what we want. Sometimes we get much more than what we want. So in theory, we're not in control. In practice, we're not in control, because we're not in control of the outcome. And in the moment, there is the fortunate feeling of free will, which doesn't leave us once this is the dynamics of life are seen more clearly. That is the gift that we as humans are given, a feeling of having free will. And so from this perspective, we can start to see, my free will, what feels like my choice, which I actually see as a choice that was always destined to happen, means that my free will and God's will are not two. That God's will comes about through, in each moment, a person following whatever they think or feel like doing. That's a description and not an assertion that because someone does what they think or feel to do, that they have independent existence. It doesn't imply that they have control. It's just a description that life unfolds through this mechanism. A mechanism of making a decision and having the feeling of free will. Feeling like it is my decision. And yet being able to investigate and see, well, actually, what I call my decision is a decision and an action happening through me. So we can call it Roger's decision as opposed to the dog's decision, or Roger's decision as opposed to Peter's decision. But when I say it was Roger's decision, I also understand that that was the decision of life, using Roger as an instrument through which a particular decision gets made. The outcome of which, not in my control. An outcome that might deliver pain to myself, might deliver pain to another, or could deliver pleasure to myself or pleasure to another. So then on this basis, someone could ask, well, if life is completely predetermined, how should I live my life? And the answer, also a description and not really a prescription, even though the question was asking for a prescription. The answer that sounds like a prescription but actually is a description. So you have to think about this maybe after the fact. The answer is this: in each moment, do exactly what you think or feel to do. And then once you have done whatever you think or feel to do, sit back and relax, knowing that the outcome isn't in your control. Sometimes you get what you want, sometimes you don't get what you want, sometimes you get much more than what you want. Sit back, relax, and see what happens. With the attitude of understanding that the decision was part of the predetermined story of life, the only decision I could have made, in fact, God's will, or life's will. And with this attitude, then we sit back with no regrets in the past, meaning no regrets for the decisions that were made in the past, regardless of the positive outcomes or the negative outcomes, because the regret is something that sees those decisions as something that I, as a separate independent entity, made, and imagines that this human instrument could have made a different decision. That imagination is based on not seeing the human being as a biological and psychological instrument. That imagination is based on knowing oneself as an entity that is completely responsible, an entity that has some volition in making a decision. And so if that's dissolved, then the regret in the past doesn't happen. The complaining in the present doesn't happen, because we understand that the moment is the way it is, sometimes pleasure, sometimes pain, and complaining about it isn't going to change it. By all means, in the present moment, do anything you can to improve the situation. But complaining about it is not changing it. More action and less complaining is fine. And with this understanding, then the expectation in the future doesn't happen, because it's understood that, well, the future is going to turn out one way, and that way is not in my control, but part of the unfolding of life. So decision-making can become a much more effortless process. Some people will make decisions based on a calculated approach to the situation. They will do that if that's part of their genes and up-to-date conditioning. They have to approach a decision from a calculated point of view if that's their makeup. Someone else might find that they simply can't look at a decision from a calculated point of view. Their logic or their skills of analysis are not something that work particularly well. And so Ramesh's suggestion was, if that's the case and you find it hard to make decisions, then toss a coin. Because if you find yourself tossing a coin, it means it was part of the story of life, destiny, for the decision to get made through that mechanism. The mechanism of making a decision using a coin toss to come to the choice. That is, in a way, as valid a way of making a decision as a calculated approach. The outcome, not in your control, one way or the other, and you are functioning according to your makeup. So someone who has the capacity and interest in making a calculated decision won't find tossing a coin an acceptable method of making a choice. However, someone who says, I simply can't make a decision through analysis, I just get lost. The suggestion is, well, if it makes sense to you to allow a coin to make the decision, then that's valid, because if it happens, it's part of the story of life.
What if there is so much fear sometimes with taking any decision, because there are always going to be consequences to be lived, and one has seen in life that one has taken decisions and there have been consequences, and nobody else has come forward and have had to deal and digest those consequences. So I reach a point sometimes when I say it's best not to take a decision, which in itself is a decision.
Mm-hmm. So that's a very important point that we need to consider or be aware of in decision making, that not making a decision is a valid decision. And if that happens, then that too we can look at as life unfolding And in that moment, it was destined for a decision not to be made. And we can look at it as, I didn't make a decision, which meant that the decision was to make no decision. The other thing we have to acknowledge is what you've pointed out, that decisions have outcomes. The outcome is what I'm pointing out is not in your control. Right? No matter how calculated a decision you make, there are still going to be factors that can change the outcome or can influence the outcome, such that it is not what you expected. This is not to say that a calculated decision or someone who makes calculated decisions might not find the outcomes of their decisions more in line with what they would like, because the act of functioning a particular way has its correlation to what comes next. But what's important is to understand if we don't have that capacity, it's just not part of our makeup, so it's not possible to function that way. So even if we hear that making calculated decisions may mean that we get better outcomes more frequently, keeping in mind that it doesn't mean we will always get positive outcomes. And we can also see there are times when we make non-calculated decisions and we get great outcomes. Yeah? There is always going to be an outcome. The outcome means either pleasure or pain, part of the circumstance of life, part of the flow of life. If our self-identity is highly attached to outcomes, meaning if there is the strong belief that my happiness, my completion, my fullness is to be found in outcomes, is to be found when life looks a particular way, then each time we are faced with a decision, it can feel like a quasi-life or death decision.
Like a survival situation. A survival situation.
Like I have to make the right decision, because if I make the wrong decision, which means pain, that's an attack on who I am. Which is one of the ingrained beliefs, part of our attitude, that can make decision-making very difficult. And if that's the case, once again, we go back to the overriding attitude that if it's in place, will deliver peace, which means I understand that my genes and up-to-date conditioning include the attachment to outcome. And therefore it makes sense that a decision is going to be difficult, because I will be insistent attitudinally on getting a certain outcome, wanting my decision to be the right decision. And so then there can be a peace with the fact that it's hard for us to make decisions. It's like, what to do? Life has infused this attachment to outcomes. And so in this moment, it's not possible for me to make a decision and relax. It means I'm going to feel fear around making a decision, because I fear the outcome as something that can add or subtract from me. Or I relate to the outcome as something that can add to me or subtract from me, and therefore I am fearful of the uncertainty factor. So not necessarily something to fix, but much more something to understand why it is hard to make a decision, and find a relaxation through that understanding. Find a relaxation with the fact that it's difficult for me to make decisions. The weaker that the attachment to outcomes is, the more we are, I guess, in flow with life, meaning the more we can feel when life doesn't want us to make a decision, that waiting becomes perfectly valid. even understanding that waiting might mean that you miss an opportunity, because the opportunity might no longer be there because you waited so long. And you understand, yes, that's an outcome of the decision to make no decision, which feels appropriate to me. Especially feels appropriate because feeling to make a particular decision isn't there. So a lot of the suffering around decision making is where we impose an insistence that I need to make a decision within a certain time frame. And if the feeling towards one of the options isn't there, then we judge ourselves as not making the decision properly. We say, why can't I choose? And the answer is you can't choose because a feeling towards a particular option, a preference towards one of the several options, isn't presenting. And so if we see it's not presenting and we understand, that means that I'm not meant to make a decision in this moment. The story of life hasn't included the impetus for a decision, hasn't included impulse that says, yes, this is the one I'm going to take. And so I can't take a decision. And if we can find ourselves relaxing into the fact that a decision isn't being made, then the waiting for feeling to arise that directs us towards one of the options, then that waiting period can happen without our peace of mind being disturbed. So remember, I'm describing different ways that decisions get made and different attitudes to the process of decision making, a process that can sometimes be an extended process over days or weeks or months. And even though I describe one as better than the other, this isn't an instruction or a suggestion for you to suddenly start functioning according to the one that is described as more optimal. This is a description of the different forms, the different biological and psychological reactions that arise in us. And so if we can just start seeing these biological reactions, and decision making is a biological reaction, if we can see these biological reactions and then the subsequent psychological reactions towards the biological reaction, that's really what is most important, is a shift that starts creating some space, some distance between the functioning, both on a biological and a psychological level, and the witnessing of that. And that, to me, can be described from one perspective, from the causal perspective, as a shift in the neurology of the brain, a shift in the structure of the neural network. And how does that structure change? It changes by life introducing new suggestions, for example, or new inputs. If the new inputs are asking the person to see things from a different angle, to see something from a different angle than it saw them from before, in a sense it's asking, well, the analogy could be like asking the person to change positions. But really the suggestion is asking the brain to change its position. It's asking the processing of the brain to be different. And so if the spiritual teachings start introducing descriptions that are different to the descriptions we've had of life previously, those descriptions are part of a change, and a change that's being described here as a change of the neural network. So what are some of the descriptions that are different from what we've had before? Some of the descriptions are witness biological reactions arising in the moment. A biological reaction arising in a body-mind organism. Witness a thought arising in a body-mind organism. So a thought is a form of biological reaction, especially if some thoughts are part of the psychological reaction. But some thoughts, like, oh, I wonder what should I have for dinner? That thought can be a biological reaction. So witness the biological reaction of thought arising in a body-mind organism. Witness an emotion arising in a body-mind organism. So when we call it a body-mind organism, essentially we're reinforcing that the body-mind is an instrument. We're calling it an organism. An instrument based on genes and up-to-date conditioning, which implies essentially it's a mechanical instrument, biological mechanics. And if we're talking about witnessing or seeing a thought arising as an output of this mechanical instrument, this biological mechanical instrument, what is being introduced is a set of descriptions that is not what we're used to hearing in life. We're not used to relating to thoughts that arise in a body-mind organism as being the output of a machine. We're used to seeing them as mine, as me doing that. So this description is essentially turning something that we are relating to as if it is of the subject and describing it more and more as an object. So the body-mind organism is being described as an object, a three-dimensional object in the manifestation. And the thought is described as an object or an output of the three-dimensional object, the body-mind organism. This subtly is changing the way that the brain relates to aspects of life, changes the way that the brain sees what's happening. And the practical change that can happen is suddenly the output, the experience that's created by the brain is an experience that includes what we can call witnessing, an experience that includes a space to its own creations that wasn't there before. Previously, the brain created an experience that included heavy involvement of the brain, essentially, in the thinking. And as the experience is described differently, as the brain receives this new information, changes happen, and at some point, the brain produces an experience that is qualitatively different to the experience it was producing before. It produces an experience where the awareness of the human being is witnessing the objects that arise in the consciousness from a different perspective. So, what is often described as awareness of source, recognizing objects arising in the moment from an unidentified perspective, a perspective of non-identification, can be explained, can be described from the perspective of talking about a change, a structural change in the brain, and therefore a changed output of the brain, meaning a different experience arising in mind. So I'm using the word brain as the machine that projects the experience onto consciousness or mind. And if the brain produces the experience differently, then what is projected onto mind is essentially going to be qualitatively different. So we have what can be called the identified experience of life that feels a particular way, feels like the me is a contracted object, and that can shift to a different experience that feels qualitatively different, where there is no longer the sense of me being defined as a very restricted and limited object. So all of that really is an explanation of why the teaching, and any teachings, if we look at any awakening teachings, they're essentially emphasizing this notion of being dispassionate towards what happens in the flow of life, dispassionate towards pleasure and pain, meaning non-involvement. They are describing things as maybe unreal to create a dispassion with them. They are maybe describing things as unreal versus that which is real to create a juxtaposition, which is part of these changes that I'm speaking about. So when we look at what is being encouraged, often it's a movement that takes what is happening and sees what is happening from a different perspective, from a less personal perspective.
Thank you.
So you can even witness the decision-making process happen. You can witness the analysis of the various options. So if you're at the computer looking at various flight tickets and checking different dates, all of that is a biological reaction happening in the moment. And you can witness the body performing the biological task, see the hands typing in the different dates and what have you, pressing the button, seeing the computer calculate and present the options. Then you can witness the working mind comparing the prices, looking at the flight times, looking at the number of stops, and at some point you might see the working mind says, this is the flight I'm going to take. And then you can witness the booking and the paying of the flight with the credit card. All of that is a happening movement of the biological, and most likely, if the beliefs of doership and attachment to outcome in place, the psychological reactions will be happening simultaneously to the biological reactions. So one example is that you find a good price, a good ticket, and you say, okay, this is the one I'm going to choose, it's $300, and you reload the page, and the price comes up at $400, which now makes it only marginally better than some of the others. And that is pain in the moment, financial pain in the moment. Life has delivered financial pain The $300 ticket is now $400. You assess the situation, it's still the best option, but there's no doubt that there is financial pain having to pay $400 versus the $300 ticket that presented 5 minutes earlier. There can be a biological reaction to that financial pain, like you could swear in the moment. That is an expression of biological pain. And simultaneous to that, if the belief in doership and attachment to outcome is there, then the psychological story will kick in and extend horizontally in time. Why didn't I book it 5 minutes ago when it presented? I should have seen that was a great deal, but instead I took my time. Why did life deliver this financial pain? All of these attitudes towards what has happened that is of resistance to what has happened. Not only resistance, but then looking at oneself and the other as the doer and attributing blame or guilt to the situation. If all of that is absent, we're left with financial pain in the moment, but an acceptance. There could be a biological reaction to the financial pain. It's like, damn it, that's not suffering. If it stops there, that's the biological reaction. And then you get on with putting in your card details without the extension of the psychological guilt and blame and attachment to outcomes, carrying on. Once again, not suggesting that that's how we have to function. We can't function that way unless life puts in place all of the variables so that we do function that way. So really, don't set that up as an expectation. Oh, I need to make decisions, and when life delivers financial pain or emotional pain or physical pain, that I shouldn't blame, I shouldn't feel pride, I shouldn't have attachment to outcomes. If we do that, we're setting up an expectation that may be out of line with the way we're designed to function. So the point here is witness the biological reactions happening, witness the decision making, the planning of the ticket, witness the psychological, the thinking mind arising if it does. All of that can be seen as a happening in a body-mind organism. Part of life unfolding. From this point of view, life becomes really simple. So not easy. There's a difference between easy and simple. Because life will continue to be pleasure sometimes and pain at others. You might find that you come to your B&B apartment that you booked as part of your booking of the flight thing, whatever, and you're on the 6th floor. You go to use the elevator and it's out of service, and you have to carry your bags up 6 flights of stairs. So we can't say that life in that situation is easy, but from an attitudinal point of view, life can become very simple. It means you find yourself in a circumstance and you will perform, you will function according to your makeup and according to the circumstance you find yourself in. So attitudinally, the resistance that made life the opposite of simple made life much more complicated, can fall away. So life then isn't necessarily easy. Someone's circumstance might mean they have to work very hard in life in order to support their family and what have you. But it can be very simple. In each moment, I am forced to do whatever I think or feel to do, given my circumstance. So this is peace of mind in daily living for the human being, where after liberation, we're still forced to live our life until the body dies in this world as the human being, dealing with the situation that presents itself, making decisions moment after moment after moment throughout the day. None of that changes. Life continues to be sometimes pleasure and sometimes pain. Outcomes still not in your control. And yet we can find that the resistance, the attitudinal resistance to the flow of life, meaning the circumstance, how it unfolds, the attitudinal resistance can fall away. So that's peace of mind regardless of the circumstance you find yourself in. As opposed to finding yourself in the circumstance and having an attitudinal resistance, adding an extra layer of suffering, which is really an uncomfortableness with oneself and the other, on top of the either fortunate or unfortunate circumstance in life. And you might say, well, what would the suffering be on top of the fortunate circumstance in life? I'd only suffer if it's an unfortunate circumstance in life. Well, that would be good if it was the case. It turns out that because we're attached to outcomes, because there is a belief that my happiness, my completeness is to be found out there in the future, then when enjoying, we don't even get to fully enjoy the pleasures that are presented, because the thinking mind is already kicking in, saying, well, what will happen if this ends? Looking into the future, let's say on a 5-day holiday, on day 4, you're already thinking about how the day after tomorrow you've got to get back to work. So that thinking gets in the way of fully enjoying the pleasures in the moment, adding this layer of the thinking mind, this layer of uncomfortableness with life on top of the situation, even when it's pleasurable in the moment.
Roger, in this understanding that human being is just a three-dimensional object or instrument with a feeling. And for instance, if understanding happens, the habits, if, let's say, one who has bad habits, let's say eating too much or drinking or smoking or just anything, does it change by itself, or it remains the same, or the human body mind instrument still just it's a feeling It's a feeling being who agrees or don't agree, who likes or don't like what is presented as habits.
Mm-hmm.
So how does it change, or it doesn't change? Maybe can you explain a little bit more in detail?
There's a paradox to the answer. On the one hand, it's best in a way to look at the behaviors and the functioning as a happening. Essentially, you could just look at it as the biological reaction, where you acknowledge, yes, my biological reactions are not, we could say they're part of my shortcomings. Let's say I have a short temper, if that's the case. And you can see, yes, it's not great for the people around me. It's not great for me because I don't intend to get angry and deliver pain to the others, but I do, right? So that it's best in a way to look at that as the biological reaction and understand that what's being spoken about here, happiness for the human being, is not talking about improving the biological reactions, but rather about our attitude to those biological reactions. So on the one hand, that's how we should look at it, because it's very clear that the freedom is an attitudinal freedom. On the other hand, if we have the capacity to see subtle differences in a healthy way, right? Then we could start to look and see, okay, some behaviors are directly linked to the attitude of doership and attachment to outcome. Some habits, some addictions, let's say, some forms of blame, which can be for example, intentions we have, and then actions following those intentions can come from the, let's say, the resentment, the hatred towards another. And if that's the case, then you would find some behaviors changing. If the doership and attachment to outcomes were influencing certain behaviors, then those behaviors will change if the ingrained attitude of doership and attachment dissolves. However, having explained that, it's very easy for the thinking mind to start wishing that a lot of the behaviors, or not only wishing, but interpreting a lot of those behaviors as being part of the thinking mind, an expression of the thinking mind, and then wanting them or expecting them to change. So even with this nuance, it's very healthy to just look at all of one's behaviors as quasi-biological, even if some of them are psychological, because the fact is that we create a conceptual distinction for good reason between the biological and the psychological, but in relation to this particular point, they are both happenings according to our genes and up-to-date conditioning. They are both things that we can't control. And so the healthy attitude of the healthiest attitude is to see both the biological and the psychological, when they happen, as a happening that is part of the circumstance, and therefore either pleasure or pain. And to focus much more on our attitude to what's happening, rather than the manifestation, rather than the outcomes, even if the outcome can be linked deep down to an attitude. So,
important question for me, topic, because my son has a problem with drinking and some kind of drugs. And the question is like, he's responsible for it or not?
No.
From this point of view, he is not the doer. It's totally genes and conditioning. Despite of the fact that I don't take drugs, it may come from surrounding. It doesn't matter from where. Yeah.
You know, everything that anyone has ever done is stemming from the same root or the same factors, the genes and up-to-date conditioning. Anything anyone has done throughout history and to the end of time is a happening and not someone's doing.
Mm-hmm. So the people who, maybe you know Wayne Lickerman, he wrote a book, Advaita and 12 Steps of Alcoholic Anonymous.
Right.
There he describes, because he was alcoholic before himself. And he says that, the whole program of them is based on total powerlessness. That they cannot, in the beginning, they accept they cannot do anything, and they rely totally on higher power. But how you can explain this? What does it mean, rely on higher power? It will change if it changes, or who is going to change?
So you're talking...
In a way, they pray to God to help them to get rid of this habit. It's not which destroys their life.
Yeah, so you're talking about the 12-step program, right?
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
So one of the principles in the 12-step program, which you're describing, is handing over your life to God or to a higher power. Now, that is an attitudinal handing over. So Ramesh would sometimes say that, often when we pray to God, we are begging God for something, right? And he said that's not the healthiest of attitudes to form a prayer from. But if that's what's part of our makeup, if there's a strong attachment to outcomes, then we are going to be forced to pray that way, where we're essentially begging God for better outcomes. The handing over of one's life to a higher power doesn't have to have a particular attitude in it. You can hand over to a higher power with a healthy attitude, rather than begging, please God, give me this. It can be, it's actually speaking about surrender. It's about realizing, and for people who have strong addictions, it can sometimes be easier to realize this because of their particular life experience. They can realize, actually, I really am not in control. I've been trying to stop this habit for years and years, and if I was in control, I would have stopped by now. And so a realization, a really seeing the evidence from one's own life can bring about this surrender, which is different to giving up. It's a form of giving up, but it's a surrender, a giving up with insight. It can come through despair. You can surrender through really hitting rock bottom and complete despair that is so full, the despair is so full that it bursts through and turns into surrender. But you can have surrender without that complete despair, where you realize by looking, you say, but the realization is grace in a sense. The realization, I really can't be the doer. I can't do this myself. I actually need to hand over and hand my life over and say, it's in your hands now. I can't do this.
Yeah. But if everything is predetermined, and let's say that everything is according to the will of God, is it possible that the God will change his own rules for the benefit of few guys who are praying for him?
He's not changing the rules. What it means is that the story is written for, in that moment, the alcoholic or the addict to realize, so that realization is part of the story. In the realization, there is a handing over, a surrender. So it's all part of the story. And now that the story has created an individual with less doership and less attachment to outcome, because the handing over of surrender is really saying, I'm not the doer, I can't do this. Then it makes sense that if certain variables have changed, certain outcomes will change. Things might take on a new trajectory. The new trajectory is not the changing of destiny. So it's not really, it's a new trajectory relative to the trajectory that was happening before. But that change of trajectory was always going to happen that way. So the praying is part of the story, and the outcome of the prayer is already in place. Whether God delivers, when I say God, we have to be very careful here. I'm not talking about a God as a separate entity. I'm talking about God as a theoretical source. And to be more precise in the framework that's put forward is we say this theoretical source existed in potentiality before life came into existence. At some point, the source exploded into actualization or exploded into manifestation, potential turning into actualization. And so God became the story. God became the addict. God became the outcome. So there really isn't an addict praying to some God out there, but rather God turning into the whole manifestation, including the addict and the freedom for the addict, should that happen, or the continuation of the addiction. So when it comes to this question of will my behaviors change after the dissolving of the belief in personal doership and attachment to outcome, there's a fun story in a way of how Nisargadatta responded to a Westerner who was questioning him about his enlightenment based on how he behaved in life. So the lady asked him or suggested to him, he said, you call yourself enlightened, and yet here you are sitting in a tiger skin, because that was the meditation seat that was often used there to insulate from the cold, sitting in a tiger skin, a dead animal, and smoking bidis, chain smoker. Nisargadatta's response was, I didn't kill the tiger, and I've been smoking for my whole life. I like it. Why should I change now?
Yeah, if he likes it, it's one thing. But if still he sees that it's destroying his own life, it's quite another story. But what I remember, I heard in Ramesh what he's saying. What you do in the moment, what you talk in the moment, what you think in the moment, what you feel in the moment is exactly what God wants you to do, speak, think and feel.
Exactly. Yeah.
So nothing changes, and even the attitude, it's like if it is predetermined, the attitude changes, it will change. If not, not.
Even your attitude is not in your control.
Uh-huh.
The insight that we have that can change the attitude, also not in your control, but a happening.
And the attitude to the attitude also. So nothing is in my control. Nothing. Absolutely.
That's what this is suggesting, so you can relax.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
If
Yeah.
we really see this,
Uh-huh.
rather than just believe it, I mean, to just believe the concept is not ideal. But to ask, how can I see, how can I know, how can I have clarity on the fact that everything is happening exactly as it's destined to happen? That's the question you need to ask. It's no good saying, oh, I believe that we are always functioning the only way we can. We need to ask, how can I have clarity about this? And then get an explanation and see if the explanation satisfies, if the explanation, in a sense, allows you or forces you to see life radically differently.
Very often there is this, notion that there is like enlightenment, understanding, it's grace. And what is grace? It's like a sudden intervention of the higher force, or it is also a part of something that is predetermined. So if the grace is predetermined, it will happen.
That's right.
Or if it is not predetermined, it will not happen.
That's right.
The grace also follows the rules of predetermination.
It doesn't
of destiny.
Grace doesn't follow the rules, but grace is part of the manifestation, part of the flow of what happens next.
But destiny is part of the destiny? Grace, part of the destiny? Or it can change the destiny?
No, it's part of the destiny. So we have to define what do we mean by grace? Grace effectively is a word that is used to describe a happening in the moment that is clearly felt as not my doing. Like I didn't make this happen, and it's very often linked to, or used. The word grace is used to a happening that leads to a very beneficial outcome, especially a beneficial outcome in relation to this topic of freedom. So it's sort of what happens is we can see that like a lightning bolt comes out of nowhere and strikes us. And strikes us in a way that leaves a beautiful design on our shoes, for example. And we say, wow, what grace. Not my doing. And the outcome is a beautiful set of shoes, better than I had before, because it left this amazing pattern on the shoes. And so that's just an analogy. It's like a lightning bolt that hits us, and we see everything completely different. Not everything completely. We see that there is no doer, for example. So how did that insight, how did that change happen? Often those changes happen where by default that we, in the change is seeing that there is no one in control, but there is life happening. So when that happens, it's felt, this wasn't my doing, like nothing is my doing. So grace is really just a word used to label a particular happening at a particular point in time that delivers a certain outcome or certain result. So grace, what we call grace, is part of the unfolding of life.
I just wanted to say that I feel too much resistance today in today's satsang.
Can you see it as a happening? So, often a question that is put forward is, what can I do about this suffering, or why is the suffering arising? What am I not getting? What more do I need to understand? And an answer that I think can be quite appropriate, because there's a nuance. Something needs to hit in the head, because the question itself is part of the suffering. The basis of the question is part of the suffering dynamic. The answer is that if we can look at life as a masterpiece, a creation, and that the artist, the master artist, has used the color of suffering a lot in the masterpiece. It is a very valid color, flavor, and it has been used by the artist a lot. We can witness the moment as a creation with lots of different layers, lots of different colors. That can be the realization, oh, I thought I was the one that created the masterpiece, which I didn't see as a masterpiece. I thought I was the one that created the suffering in this moment. Or I thought I was the one that created the decision and the outcomes. And now I see I simply cannot be the doer. I am part of the masterpiece. Ramesh used to remark on the practice of vipassana, and he had read an article in the newspaper that was promoting vipassana, and he said he found something a little odd. He said the practice was described as a practice where the sensations in the body were felt and witnessed. That if there was an itch that arose, the practice encouraged the itch to be felt, for awareness to land on the itch, and for it to be witnessed as a happening in the body-mind organism. And Ramesh said it stopped there, at least what the journalist had written. And Ramesh said when the understanding goes deep enough and deeply, what will happen is, what will be witnessed is not only the itch arising, but rather the itch arising and the hand moving towards the itch and scratching the itch, and then returning back to a resting position. So what at first is not encouraged, because it can get in the way of allowing the sensation to intensify, such that attention is fully on it and isn't or that nothing is interfering with awareness of that sensation. When that witnessing goes deeper, the witnessing then can witness the body moving. The body is part of that which is witnessed. So an itch arises, and then the body scratches it. All a happening arising, witnessed by that which is aware of what's happening.